Hey, I can't I can't hear you. Can you hear me? I'm going to do my introduction for Katie Shepherd. So as listeners are listening now, yeah, this is part of it.
Okay, one last step. Ty, I'm rolling. Everything's happening.
Rolling. Katie Shepherd, the one and only. Katie's a writer, a producer, audio producer, published writing in the New York Times and elsewhere, hosted all sorts of podcasts, teacher, a student, all around creative thinker and contributor, and someone who's truly one of a kind, and that I'm happy to have finally on the program.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome, Katie.
Thank you for having me. What a delight.
This is fun.
Yeah.
I know, this is great. Too bad it couldn't be in person. I feel like I often, when we're at parties or gatherings, you and I sometimes float into the corner and have a lot of conversation that I wish some of at least has been recorded, but now we get a chance here, and there'll be many more chats in the future.
I know, we do always seem to find a way to get very deep at like a, cheese gathering.
Yeah. Yeah, within like 3 seconds, we're talking about a new project or idea or something.
Or just something that has struck us both to consider things differently, yeah.
Yes. So let's get into it. You're a writer.
Yes.
First and foremost, that's your passion, it seems.
Writer is one of those things. I mean, I know you've done some writing as well. Also, for listeners, I can see him sipping on a Topo Chico, which is just like 10 out of 10. Oh, yeah.
Guilty.
I think anybody that is a writer, you find it difficult to sort of own the capital W of that. And I think maybe you always feel that way, or at least for a while. But yes, that is the main pursuit. Yeah.
Yeah. And what do you recall what made you interested in it at first, or what drew you to it?
I do remember being a very voracious reader as a young kid. My mom worked nights, and so she would take me to the library, and I would be able to get 3 books and a book on tape. And so I've always loved audio since the beginning. I would try to get quite ambitious and try to check out 10 books. And my mom would be like, you have homework, and you should have a life. But yeah, from a very early age, I always loved writing. And I don't think it was actually until I became a teacher. I was a high school English teacher for 1 year. I did all the training and taught for many years because you do that throughout your education. But I don't think it was until I did that. And I actually remember teaching American Lit and, going through Salinger and that kind of thing. And it was really a moment for me where I was like, wait, I have to do this. And you hate for it to be Catcher in the Rye, but inevitably it's Catcher in the Rye, and you're like, oh, I have to do. Holden gets in your ear, and you lose yourself. And he has just enough existential angst to be palatable. But yeah. And then I think sometimes I write things and I still think it's very bad. But I think there was a great feeling that I had to do it.
Yeah. And what did you like about it? What was it that struck you about Catcher in the Rye or anything, or the feeling of writing?
Yeah, I mean, I also remember that during that same time reading like Water for Chocolate and lots of the classics, of Mice and Men, and the way in which I could see the students responding to books.
Yeah.
It really was a way in which they came alive in a different kind of way. It wasn't just, now we're going to deconstruct a sentence for grammar, or we're going to go over your vocabulary, or we're going to write your personal essay for college, But it was like, this was really engaging with something that, I mean, you could even get somebody that didn't care to be invested in a story or characters or, a driving motivation of someone. And that really excited me, the possibility to be able to inform and persuade, but also connect in that way. It's part of entering adulthood, I think, is entering a sort of conversation with language and thought and passion and like the cravings of humankind. That I think is why I got into that as a subject matter, and then subsequently have been on the pursuit personally. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And what are you working on now?
In the realm of writing, I have written some essays, so I'm working on those just as individual pieces. And I'm also working on a novel-length project. It's really compelling to see the ways those two things speak to each other and don't speak to each other, and the way they demand different things. You have great optimism for both. But yeah, so I think I'm working on both of the forms at once, but trying to finish a book-length project, which feels like Everest some days.
Well, good for you for staying at it. What is the experience, I guess, of doing them in tandem, and how do they feed each other?
Well, I'd love to know like your thoughts on it too, because I know you wrote some fiction for a minute there. What I love about nonfiction is when it's working, I mean, everything is working. Like reporting this on a sentence level, on a like propulsion, it's like all there. And it's unbelievable when it comes together. The challenge of fiction is, trying to keep it fiction. And then also, but then it's funny because when I work on an essay, I'm like, oh, I wish this could have the same mode as a short story. And then when I'm working on a short story or a novel length project, I'm thinking, oh, I wish I could do some essayistic moves to get through this in a different way. So I think right now it's all about just building muscle.
Yeah. Yeah. Staying at it, getting the reps in, as they say.
Yeah.
Even if you're not sure where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about storytelling and kind of what you're thinking about when you're writing, but also you've done a lot of podcast creation, and maybe we don't need to try to meld the two, but I'm interested, I guess, in talking about, with your experience, with your education, and with your continued practice, how do you think about stories, and kind of what do you feel makes a good one?
Yeah. Whoa.
But yeah, to what you were kind of getting at, I think is kind of like the flow and the pace and bringing it alive and finding, not overthinking it, but for me at least, it's how do you get to a point where you feel like it's coming out naturally, maybe the way you would say it in a kind of a passionate conversation that you're having without editing yourself at first, and then going back and trying to make it coherent, which is, similar to what the thing I sent you the other day, the other audio project I'm working on is how do you make it come to life in a way that makes it listenable or readable, but also staying true to the initial thoughts that you felt that made you want to write it in the first place.
Yeah. I actually am very interested in things that, obviously nonfiction needs to be fact-checked, and upheld to some standard specifically today. But I do think that I'm really interested in hybrid form. Obviously because I'm interested in both podcasting and writing. And I don't see those things as different from one another in many ways. But I also think about your question, what is a good story, or what makes a good story? Well, one, you experience in a way, it's about the experience of the piece, right? Whether you're reading along or listening along or however you're consuming it, it actually interacts with you on a cellular level. And I do think it does sort of enter some higher, better part of ourself. Even if it's showing us how terrible we are, it is still incredible when it does that. What makes a good story to me also is clarity, being able, not trying to topple somebody over the head with how smart you sound, which is, also often what, and I've done it, like often what in essayistic form you feel like, oh, I have to be, academically relevant in this way that feels, pertinent to the times, but also, which you should be politically engaged and interested in things, but it shouldn't, destroy the sentence. But I also think that for for fiction, I think, and I think the same is true for both, but really thinking about it for fiction lately is, do I believe in this world? Do I believe in these people? Do I believe in their problems? Do I care to know what happens? Am I presented with something in a way that feels like I haven't, even if it is the same set of problems, that I'm engaging in it in a way that causes me to think about it differently or newly, or even if I'm like coming at it in a way that feels, like it's been experienced before? Is there some type of like illumination in that? A good story, can be super small, or it could be, a doorstop novel. But I think it's about whether or not you want to know the end. And when you reach the end, you feel changed somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a grandiose plot or, flashy story. As I'm saying this, I'm thinking of Stoner, which you told me about. And it's an interesting example of, not that much happens, like in quotes, not that much happens, but you're brought into the world of this person whose life is quite ordinary on the surface. But the way that it's written, for some reason, you're completely wrapped in it, and you want to know what happens, and you really feel connected to the character, even though if you were to describe the plot, it would sound boring.
There's something to be said about focusing on the seemingly mundane and the small parts of ourselves. A lot of great writers, a lot of really incredible poets do that. And I think good essayists do it as well. But, it's about being specific, which is, difficult to do and usually comes with editing. For that book in particular, I think about that feeling of being immersed in that world. And even if it is not, kings and queens and court jesters, it's something about feeling as though you've submerged into a consciousness that feels as though it is exploring things that you are not even opening up for yourself, or that you have, and it's articulated so well that you're devastated. Yeah, so I think for me, that's why something like that can keep it small. That's not to say that there aren't huge stories to be told, but those also are magnificent in their own kind of ability to keep it between the covers,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think too, to that point, is sometimes when you read something that's really great, or listen or see something on film, it points out something that maybe you felt before but never put words to. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it makes you think that you felt it before, but maybe you hadn't. Mm-hmm. And then it opens up a new kind of corridor for you to experience the story, but also your own life.
Also, thinking about what makes a good story, for me at least, and the writers that I love, is that there's a sense of I actually mean how, like, growing up in the South, people just talk in this way that is unbelievable when you really sit down and think about, like, the colloquialisms and the metaphors and all that are at play. And in the UK, I lived there for a year. In England, they do that as well. And the way in which, even like in Boston, places like that, the way in which language is sort of driving interactions in this incredibly exciting way that you take for granted until you really slow it down and take a look at how that can be, yielded in this way to make it feel like you're coming up against like flesh, like a real character. Yeah.
I guess when it's done well, it doesn't feel at all stilted or overdone
or insincere.
It feels real.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned editing, and I'm interested in that. You've obviously been trained in that. You've practiced that. Editing and feedback, because you seem to be very good at both, but both are hard, particularly feedback, giving it, receiving it. Let's talk about that, kind of what you're thinking about,
feedback,
how to do it well.
Feedback in my MFA was hard. I think, it was hard. There's no, I would have to take really long walks afterwards and sort of decompress, because it's like an hour straight of people that are really intelligent, wanting, 12 to 15 different things from your writing.
And I'm going to pause you for a sec, Katie. For listeners, Katie recently completed a MFA in creative nonfiction writing from Columbia.
Yeah. Be paying for that forever. Woo! And so in the moment, I found it to be like kind of a suffering. It was pretty miserable. But I actually feel like, given some time, because, I'm also simultaneously getting like editorial feedback on things that are going out into the world, like for work. So it was a lot of feedback, and a lot of feedback on a book length project, all these things. It became helpful for me to realize the ways in which things can be, the way in which they can be, not limited is the right word, but the ways in which they can feel constricting. And that I think it's important to know the weaknesses of your writing, just to know them. They always say to like sort of edit like, the meanest person is reading it. And then to like simultaneously edit it the next pass, like the nicest person is reading it. And I've had to go through some pretty like intense workshop experiences to be able to get to the other side and realize that it is really just about the piece. It's about the object in front of the other person. And especially when you're writing from your real life, it can feel, or some fictionalized version of your real life, I think it can feel quite personal and quite right to the gut. But once I entered like the professional working world recently, I found it much easier to take feedback, because I'd been through like so many reps of just getting like, okay, it's not there yet. Oh, it's not good enough yet. Oh, it's not. And then at some point you stop being so devastated that the first version of anything you write isn't brilliant. Nor is probably the fifth version. And that it's about, kind of a different kind of labor that you have to put in. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Staying at it, not taking it personally, which is hard when it is something that is personal.
Yeah.
But not taking the criticisms, if you can call them that, as anything other than a suggestion for improvement, suggestion for clarification. But it takes a long time, and it's not always fun.
Yeah, and it also, you can even hear in my like angst talking about feedback. One, right now we're in a time where like writing is so online, or like the lives of writers are so online, that like you have to be able to take feedback you don't like, because it's there with the way social media and the internet function. And so I think it was some type of like, cruel boot camp in a way, when it went badly. The other thing about feedback is that it really is, one of my professors was like, you have to know when to say like thank you and walk away, right? Which is hard for me because I want to make everybody happy and I want to make it, but actually like then like where's the integrity in that? Like where's the integrity in being able to be like, actually I stand by this and I'm proud of this and I follow through on this 100%.
What else from your MFA program, from your ongoing practice, what stands out in terms of what you've learned, what you're taking with you as you continue to stay at it?
The first thing that I've really had to consider is, do I belong to myself or not? Because, you're entering a profession that if you're a woman, you most likely will get it at like the last, 10 years of your life. Somebody will be like, nice job. Yeah. And do a retrospective, or you'll die and then that'll happen. Or, maybe neither of those things will happen, which would be even the hardest to deal with because maybe you could like feel that from a realm beyond or something. I think it's just really important to ask yourself every day, even when it goes badly, even when you get a bunch of rejections, even when you feel like nobody cares, even when you feel like even you are like, do I care about like this character, like to be able to like cultivate that like compassion and love and interest over and over and over and over and over again. Well, one, it's about having a long-term vision. And as an Aries, I'm very interested in like things happening faster, which they don't. And I also think it's sort of understanding this question of, at the end of the day, like I'm the one that has to be okay with what I made. And I'm the one that has to be okay with how I am like moving through the writing world. And I'm the one that has to be okay with whether or not I feel like the work that I'm doing is meaningful. Instead of, whereas so much of the urge, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but so much of the urge is like, is this good enough? Am I good enough? Does it matter? And to be able to sort of like meet the void every day. I think at first I really struggled. You become more into yourself within that kind of labor.
Yeah. Yeah, and something new is uncovered every time you step up to the plate, so to speak, as long as you're showing up.
Yeah, I mean, even with this project you're working on now, like this podcast that you're working on, I mean, all that you get at first is like a blinking cursor on a blank page, right? And then you get a version down and you're like, okay, some of what I thought that was going to be is there, because it always is way better in your head. There's always like Philip Glass has like done the soundtrack, and and like some part of it is magnificent, yeah. And instead it's like skeletal and malnourished in this way.
Right. Yeah, it's true. It's because if it is coming from the heart, you probably feel it so deeply. And yeah, it's scored by Philip Glass, and it's complex and fascinating the way that you're feeling it. And then speak for myself, put it down, and it's just complete nonsense and incoherent.
Or you're like, that one paragraph is good.
Right, right. For me, a lot of it is just kind of metaphysical, and it feels kind of like navel gazing a little bit once it's down on paper, and especially when someone else reads it and they're kind of like, what are you trying to say? You got to put some specifics to your generalities to make anyone have a chance of understanding what you're saying.
Yeah, there has to come a point where you begin to consider like outside of what you're making and what you're doing, that somebody is going to engage with what you've made. It has to make sense to the other person, unless you're doing some type of, avant-garde piece. And your whole thing is like, how can we not make sense? Is that on some level you have to be able to like consider that somebody needs to get through it.
Yeah. In the sea of books that are published, articles that are published, quote, content out there, great content that's out there, writing, film, podcasts, there's a universe of stuff. what have you observed? What stands out to you? How can you stand out as a creator in that universe?
Well, I think you have to make stuff like it doesn't exist, right? Or else you'll be like, oh, there's going to be that one person who hates everything I make and is going to let me know as soon as I post it, right? Like, or worse, it's going to be met to great apathy.
Right.
Like at least you would like strong emotion of some kind.
I know. Yeah, we've talked about that before, where it's like you fear people saying bad things, but then it's like, or maybe worse, you don't hear anything.
Yeah, exactly this. Yeah, but I think there's so many people making incredible things today. I mean, podcasting is exciting for me, even though it's like a really ugly word. We've got to pick a better word. I know we're like too deep. Yeah. We're too deep now, but it's such an ugly word for such a beautiful piece, a beautiful art form. I recently was a contractor at Gimlet working on a show, and the level of care that people give to that work is truly, like, you think that place doesn't exist, but then it exists. And I grew by leaps and bounds within that. No matter what happens on the internet, I think giving great care to your work gets through. Another great thing is not being afraid to not be quote unquote like literary. I mean, highbrow and lowbrow are really complicated terms that mean really complicated things. And by that I mean usually rooted in classism. You have stuff that is being made that is like relevant to how people actually are and the way in which people are actually living today, that doesn't necessarily need to be like a classic novel from 1910 or before then. And I think people that are creating stuff that feels original and fresh are usually the people that are able to surface in some way. Like if it's not there, that's what you need to make. Like you have this fear when you're making something like, oh, I don't see this anywhere. Well, then that's exactly why you need to go do it, because it's not there.
Right.
Whereas
and you'll hear.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you hear, think about what you can say, what only you can say originally. That you can say better than somebody else or more authentically than somebody else based on your own experience. Go write about that or go sing about that. And then that will feel like we were chatting about earlier. It'll have that sense of sincerity and therefore hopefully magnetism and connection to the listener or the reader, if it is authentically based on your experience or your sentiments.
Yeah, I think, I go back to that word real again. Like, does even the fiction feel honest? Does what you're even driving towards feel honest? And then does it also feel like it is informed by something that you're not just like making it in a vacuum, but you're actually like engaging with the ways in which this might impact communities that you're not a part of, or it might speak to certain privileges about yourself that you don't know that you have, or you do know that you have, but you're not like you're reaping the benefits of them without having to constantly, consider them. And so I think it's an exciting time, for the internet, because we're going to be able to get people that otherwise, might not be able to like elbow their way in this way, or like have some gatekeeper let them in, be able to make their stuff and put it online. But I also think, we run the detriment simultaneously of, or run the risk of the detriment of, performing for other people all the time, instead of making things that we need to make for the sake of making them. And that it's about the work. It's not about the reaction to the work.
Amen. And with that in mind, we've touched on in the past about the importance of who you're surrounding yourself with, the influences you're letting in, the what you're reading or listening to or watching, but also the talent of the people around you at your workplace. Can we talk more about that?
You mean specifically in regards to like watching people that work at such a high level and how that impacted me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've always been one that's like, you don't need institutions and you don't need big groups and you don't need big names in order to make your work, But simultaneously, for me, the experience of even just a contract position there, it was like, so the people that I worked with, they cared about what they made and cared about a kind of excellence that elevated something like podcasting that people are like, oh, just make me a podcast, to something that commanded sort of journalistic integrity, writerly strength to be able to sort of create and stay on par with them. And so I think it was just exciting for me to know that those people exist.
Yeah. And how did it manifest? Like, how did that level of care and attention manifest in say, a particular podcast episode? Like, what did that look like in reality in terms of the high level of attention to detail?
Yeah.
Can you give an example?
I think the biggest thing would be the amount of the number of edits that you would have to go through on a piece. And I mean like hours of sitting down with somebody and going over it line by line, piece by piece, tape by tape. It was, everything mattered down to the second. And I've never worked at a place to where you were creating stuff and then so many people were invested in making it better. Like now I'm a contractor at Slate, and they're also like the caliber of work there is unbelievable. So for a while I sort of even had the mentality of, oh, like those people do that over there. It's those people that get to make these things, And then the more that you make stuff, the better that you get. Like I go back and I listen to old stuff that I've done and I'm like, what? Like that piece of tape doesn't speak to the narration before that piece of tape has nothing to do with that piece of tape, or like the emotional tone here is like so dramatic that what does it have to do with what I'm like actually trying to say, and I'm losing the point off of the sentimentality here, or or like, oh, like why did I include that clip from that guest? I should have edited that down, or why did I have the host say this, or XYZ. You can only learn through just like reps, like it's like maybe that's like my motto, I guess, that I'm realizing is emerging, but it's like you can only. You don't know, you just are not good the first time ever. And you're probably not good the 50th time. And sometimes you might get pretty good at the 100th time. And then you have to keep like raising the level on yourself.
Right. Yeah. Inevitably you become what you do. You become what you practice. We are what we repeatedly do. Is that Aristotle quote about excellence? You kind of, for better or worse, whatever you're doing on a regular basis is what you're going to become. So if you're purposefully challenging yourself in pursuit of something that you care about, as hard as that is, as much of a quote struggle that is perhaps the most worthwhile thing you can do, because you'll eventually become better at that if you're willing to keep showing up.
A really difficult thing for me, I don't know if you ever experienced this, but a difficult thing for me is like, sort of setting aside that work ethic mentality, like have those engines running, and then just like be present in the moment and be present with the work. And this kind of striving is actually like counterintuitive to being able to grow. The times where I've been like most unhappy in my life is where I felt like, oh, if I can just get this thing, or if I just get into this room, or if I just make then I will have like figured it out, and then I get into that room and I still haven't figured it out, right? So they can't be one-to-one in that way. And so I think it's like, I don't think anything's ever one thing. And I think it's like, how can you continue to like show up even when you're in despair or whatever for your desk? And then how can you also then like keep it to where you're able to actually be present in the moment with what you're doing and be like, oh, like I am actually doing it. It's like, oh, I'm going to work on a long race, and then like actually after 5 miles, you're actually in a race, like.
Hey, yeah. No, it is. You're touching on an important point, I think, of how you look at how you arrive at something on your own terms. Because if you treat it like it's this grind and it's this battle and this, vicious struggle, then maybe you're not going to enjoy any of it either. But if it's more so, okay, self, I'm going to create some space to just do whatever it is I want to explore without putting too much weight on myself to quote, get anywhere other than just arriving in the place that you want to explore on a regular basis.
I would say that I suppose that's what I mean when I was saying that's what the MFA really taught me, is like, do I belong to myself? And it's that question of, is this work that interests me? Is when I have to go work my 40-hour-a-week job and then I come home and I get these like, this time to actually sit down and work on what I want to work on after I've already tried to, be good at my job. Is this something that is interesting and compelling and getting at something in me that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not somebody else likes it? And then I think if you can answer that question, then, not to say that things like envy and, pride and all of that won't get in the way, but I think you'll be satiated in a different way because you'll know that, like, one of my professors said this thing that I think, it changed my life. And whenever I forget it, I am usually having a bad day. Is that like the reason why she became an essayist is because you're wanting to be better than yourself, and you look back on stuff that you wrote when you were 30, and at 50, you can have a different conversation with the ideas and with even that narrator. And that to me felt like, oh, like I have to do that forever to sort of figure out what I think. And I think, I don't know if you feel this way, but especially as a young woman growing up in the South, like you get told what to think a lot, like a lot of, second wave feminism stuff coming through every now and again. But, you also get told how to be, what to think, how to behave. And maybe all children get that, but I do feel like, especially particular to my upbringing, where the impulse is like, oh, this is selfish to think about like what I think, but I also think that to me, it's like that old kind of, metaphor of like mask on first on a plane. Like, how could I possibly engage with the world if I don't have any sense of interiority that's like working hard within myself?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. A lot of reactions to things you said. I think, first of all, thinking for yourself. The times I felt the worst are the times that I felt disconnected from my own thoughts. That, which I think is what writing or any kind of genuine creative pursuit pays homage to, is what do you think? If you sit down to write something, even if you're just, searching randomly for thoughts when you wake up in the morning on a piece of paper is it's kind of a reassurance or a remembrance of, are you awake? Is there anyone in there? Like, are your thoughts your own thoughts, or are you just kind of going through the day repeating what you hear? And I think writing and creating asks you to really confront what you think. And I don't think that's, well, maybe it is selfish, like you said, putting your mask on in the airplane. If that's selfish, I don't think that's a bad kind of selfish. It is maybe the most important work to make sure you are conscious in this life. And then being better, I think being better than yourself is an interesting idea as well, because if you are creating something for only for yourself, if you're thinking about it like, I don't care if nobody reads this or listens to this, which is how I feel about this show is, I don't have a ton of people listening, but
I listen.
I always say
I'm a fan.
Yeah, thank you. But I'm kind of like, when people ask about it, I say, I love that people listen, and I'm so grateful that people listen, and especially when they tell me what they think about it. But I would also do it even if no one was listening, because like you said, or like your professor said, it when we're recording a conversation, I'm a better, I think, conversationalist than maybe I am in regular life, because it's requiring that I'm fully engaged. If it is going to be respectful of the guest's time, it's in my best interest to prepare for it and really try to listen. And that's all kind of, back to practice. Like, what do you want to practice? Conversation and listening are certainly things that I would like to be good at. So maybe this can help be kind of a forum for practice.
I don't want to blow any listeners' minds here, but your partner is my best friend. So I get to spend time in the presence of you both. Two great people. And one thing that I've always admired of you, just like beyond artistic pursuits, but is that sometimes I'll leave conversations and I'll think, damn, like he's really working on that. Is your curiosity for others. And I think that is, especially I don't love phrases like we're in a time, I wish there was a better way to say that, but curiosity for people is sort of like, how can we get curious with each other so we can critique each other? Or how can we get curious with each other so we can get something from each other? Instead of like, how can we just be genuinely curious as to like, well, how are you doing this ride that we're on,
Yeah.
And yeah, so I've always respected that about you. And I think, sorry, we're in New York. I don't know if you could tell by all the sounds that have gone on in this time. I think that is something that on days where I feel like I'm really, I've done like journaling in the morning and I've meditated or done some yoga and had like a nice time with my dog or whatever. And then I've like had some time where I've really breathed in. I like, read a book that really, knocked me out, kind of thing. And then to be able to have that time to breathe in then allows me to be like, well, who are you, and what do you want? And well, what are the things that you're seeking out? And what are things about life that you're doing that I haven't figured out yet or am missing somehow? And I find that like when I have not done the task of like breathing in beforehand, I get really overwhelmed by like how many ways there are to be a person. And so I think it's like a balance of the both. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for saying those things about me. I feel the same way about you. I think which always why our conversations are, at least for me, enjoyable and inspiring.
I'll give a cosign. I'll give a cosign.
So there's another thing you mentioned a second ago that I'm interested in. I've observed this about our generation is a lot of folks who are pursuing creative work, whether that's writing or music or pursuits that maybe you can't make a living at least right away, is they also have full-time work, full-time jobs. And I'm curious your thoughts on how the two feed each other. So if you're writing at night and you're exploring, your own internal landscape through your art, how does that influence your day-to-day working world life, and vice versa? Does the working world, what does it do for your creative work?
Sure. Like a few years ago, I had the wrong attitude about many things, but I'll probably say that about this a few years from now. But I had kind of the wrong attitude, which is like, I want to do creative work all the time, and if I'm not doing that, I'm a failure, right? I love a big F-bomb. Like, I love to think of myself as a failure at the first chance. It's like a good, strong move. And it's a way to save myself from some type of grief, I think. The grief of effort. But you have young people that are so interested in creativity for the reason that we have life online, but also because we are inherently creative beings. And I feel that we also live, in capitalism. And that is just a truth, right? I was reading this self-help book. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was talking about gravity problems and how so much suffering in life can come from a problem like gravity, to where you're like, oh, well, I don't want gravity to exist. And if it doesn't, and because it exists, I'm going to be miserable all the time. And I think unless you are of a certain, echelon of, person, to where somebody, and those people also have their own, suffering in their way of being unfulfilled. But I also think that you have young people that are able to sort of use their time in a way. So where it used to be like, oh, like I'm a failure if I'm not creating all the time. Now it's like, okay, I go to work, and I'm very incredibly lucky that I have a job that is like a job of my dreams, and that I get to do that. And then when it comes time to make things that are for me and by me in a different way, like representative of me, then this is these are the 2 hours that the rest of the day is for. So I better show up for those 2 hours, even if there is a great new release on Netflix, or, my friends are getting, and some days I do better than others. Especially in the current moment where I think I saw something today, it's 20% of people are unemployed, which is just wild. And you think about these young people that are graduating from high school and trying to go for this American college dream. And then you think about the college kids that are what did I just pay all this money for? And I think we're going to have to, as if we hadn't already started doing this, but the creative person, because I refuse to let it just continue to go to the wealthy and elite, but it's we're going to have to be able to sort of find some resonance in our everyday lives that feels pertinent to our work. And then I'll say one other thing on that is that my therapist, who's a very good therapist, I mention her a lot, saved my life more times than I should pay her more. But she said, when I graduated from Columbia, I was like, how am I going to pay for myself? Because I worked jobs all through Columbia. Would not recommend it. Worked full time while I went to school full time because I had to, because nobody helped me. And people helped me emotionally. I'm not no man is an island, no woman. But I remember hearing I would need to apply for 700 jobs before I should start to get worried. I needed to call everybody I know to see if they were hiring. I needed to be willing to do whatever. And then I tell this to my therapist, and she says, you know what? If you have to have just graduated from an Ivy League university and take a job at Starbucks, then that's what you're going to do, because you're not a quitter. And it was probably less directive than this, but it feels very, kind of Rudy in my head. But then she said, and you know what you could do you could have that experience, and then that's where you would write from, and then that would be the place that you're getting writing that isn't being written about yet. And so I think, to very long-windedly answer your question, I think it's that, like, we have to go to work. We have to put on pants. I mean, nowadays we don't, but like you have to like get ready and do the day, and you have to sort of plug in into the like adult, you know, what are the things called where people little conveyor belt kind of life, and you have to do that because you have to be a functioning part of society. And then if not, you can reject it and, you know, be whatever you want to be. But if you want to be in the game in that way, then you do that. But then it's important to remember, just as you were saying about what you were talking about writing about from your life or writing about whatever, that like you have no idea whether or not there's somebody that needs to read what you've written, and that idea has yet to be explored yet. So I would just say that you always have to be making work from where you are, you know. And while you might be aspiring to other things and you should dream, don't, you know, dream. But I think we'll see a move. I hope we see a move into like what is the everyday life of the average person, and less away from this celebrity culture and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, and from your direct experience, even if it's a job you never thought you'd have, or you're not in love with the job, inevitably, if you are awake and observant, you're going to have experiences about human nature and inner landscapes and drama and questions and interactions that are going to spur observations that then you can write about or sing about or whatever it may be.
How do you deal with it?
Vacuum, well, if you can call the podcast creative, that without a doubt helps me, inspires me in not only in the doing of it, but afterwards and in my regular life. Because again, if it's about practicing listening and questioning and trying to connect on a genuine level, I think that is absolutely transcends the thing itself into the rest of my life, because you know those are things I want to be good at in any environment. And then same for the writing, for the little bit of writing I've done. If writing means observing and thinking and looking, quote, deeply into experience, then that's also kind of, I hope that seeps into my regular life. Otherwise I'm going to be sleepwalking, which I don't want to do.
Do you think that there's a way that you can be creatively fulfilled while you like the general you of the world, that you could be fulfilled while still having to, you know, hold down the 9-to-5 grind?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the job I have now, I really genuinely enjoy, and because it requires critical thinking and teamwork and healthy competition, all things that are asking you to show up in a different way. But so I feel very fortunate by nature of really enjoying my day job in my free time work, both of which are sort of challenging in a way that I think that is making my life more interesting and hopefully making me better at skills that will be applicable elsewhere, whatever comes next, kind of generally helpful things that will serve any sort of a activity or project I'm working on.
I'm not by nature an organized person. And then, like, I worked at a pen store, and now I, like, need my room to be in absolute order, right? Because I had to put pens in order. And then I worked as an editorial assistant at a magazine, and then I started to get really organized in, like, how I send things between people or among people to be edited and viewed and all these kind of, and so it's like all of these skills that I think like, oh, this sucks, you know, are actually like informing my ability to do the things that I want to do. Exactly to your point, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to that point also, it's easy to say, follow your passion or follow your bliss, but maybe you don't know. I certainly didn't know and still don't know specifically necessarily what that is, but you have to kind of be in the game, be in the mix to figure out what you're interested in and what you're not interested in. And maybe it doesn't come right away, but without the effort, you won't make any discovery.
I also think, one person that was on your podcast was generous enough to talk to my class, Ross Simonini, who's brilliant.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And, we were talking about this idea of being a generalist. And, I think it's important to have your passion. And there's this whole thing about, you can only be one thing in life, whatever. But what about those of us that have and that's why I love audio people is, every week is a different story. Every interview needs a different thing. And there's this constant seeking that I think can be satiated in that way.
I feel like destined to be a generalist, at least so far. But I like that. I'm happy about that. And there obviously are countless interesting individuals that have done all sorts of things throughout their lifetime. And we live in a world now where that's possible, and which makes me hopeful.
I used to
about what's in store.
I used to love this artist. I mean, I do still love him, Bruno Munari, the guy, the Seeking Comfort guy, who I would love all his work. But his whole thing was, he was never really heralded as a well-known artist because he wanted to know he wanted to be in everything. He wanted to try everything. And he, became much more well-known once he got older and then towards, end of his life, past his life. But there's something to be said about just general curiosity and that can keep you alive in a way that just hitting out, another thing that you got to do and whatever. But he even had this thing called useless machines, and I got to see some at a museum here in New York. And it was little machines that he made that were just metal predominantly, bent in different ways. It didn't look like much of anything, but it was mostly him trying to get at what would it mean to make something just to make it. And what do I discover in that? And what do I understand in that about myself? Yeah.
I love it. Well, it reminds me of the moviegoer, which we've chatted about.
Yeah.
But the quote about, the search and being on to something and how it almost doesn't matter what it is, but what comes alive within you when you care about the search, as Walker Percy calls it. But that reminded me of what you were just saying about the useless machine, and the fact that it's useless doesn't matter necessarily as much as what it asked of the artist to make it.
Yeah. Yeah, and then it
reminds me of
and it doesn't become useless after that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the John Cage the thing you posted about the lecture on nothing. Mm-hmm. And this premise of creating something or telling a story that doesn't necessarily, quote, go anywhere, but that's okay.
John Cage was, brilliant in a way that is you have to be at a certain level for it to be deemed brilliance. But he also did the 4:44, I think it is. That's what it's the silence for 4 minutes where he sat down at the piano. And I think his whole, at least from what I understand from the very little that I have heard and read about him, is that his experience was in the experience, or he was concerned about what happens in these in-betweens, in these moments where the performance isn't happening, where the story isn't happening, where the lecture isn't happening, but it actually is happening.
Right.
Is you start thinking like that, you'll have to change some things about your life.
Yeah. Well, I like it because it points out, it's kind of it makes me think of back to Stoner, or the movie Slacker is coming to mind. Richard Linklater film where nothing really happens, at least not in a traditional storytelling sense. But in the everyday moments are these worlds that are endlessly fascinating to me, even if there isn't a kind of a linear plot or some great reveal or dramatic culmination. It's just the fascination of everyday life.
Yeah, I was recently, for my book club, reading the Jenny Offel's Weather. And obviously there's, a lot happening in the world with that, because it's about, essentially the world falling apart. But actually in the smallness of the characters, you sort of actually forget the tragedy, and also in the way she works language and her pacing in general. In the Department of Speculation, it was different, but the same kind of thing. And
cool.
I feel like there's a whole way to, like, because what's exciting to me and the difference between the two, at least for me, as far as podcasting and writing, or writing for podcasts and then writing for literary purposes, is with podcasting, at least how the school of thought that there is, and I'm excited to see how it will change form. Ira Glass has really sort of pioneered the way that we understand audio, which is wild to think about that, and that we're all, with probably consciously or subconsciously, mimicking him in some way, or at least like iterating on him in some way. It will be interesting to see how that form changes. But with that, it's very story forward. That audio, because there's nothing to sort of hold you, like you have to keep someone engaged, even if you do heavy reporting in some type of like who, what, where, when, why, how, all the time. And, I think there's some really exciting writing out there that doesn't need that. It doesn't ask you for that. It doesn't want that from the reader. And that's thrilling in a different way. I'm not inclined to that. I need, colors and textures, and I need to know A plus B plus D, kind of, or leads to, it will eventually lead to D. I think. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what's interesting to me about audio or written word is it requires a different type of imagination than film does, because it is asking you for that. It's asking you to visualize something. Mm-hmm. So you have to do a little bit of extra work or different work, because you can't. The image isn't fed to you. You have to imagine it, and that's kind of bringing alive the creative work while you're also enjoying the listening or the reading of it. So quarantine time, weird time. Obviously, I think it'll be weirder in retrospect. Because we're kind of gotten used to it, but it's still so strange. And I think when we're out of it, it'll seem even stranger. But what have you been finding anything interesting in terms of reading or listening or watching that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, I'm not proud of myself, but I've gotten really into NCIS. I know that puts me in like a certain demographic of like older woman who's like, alone in her house with her 2 poodles or whatever. But I actually have become fascinated with the way in which story functions in those, because it almost always inevitably, with the mic, it almost always inevitably begins with a murder. And then it begins with Gibbs coming in and being like, "We got to go. There's a body." And then they're joking over this body, right? And what we're talking about is like death, right? But somehow we're like, it's like a whodunit every time. And then the beats, and then you have like essentially your 3 beats of that, which is how something like This American Life does work. Is in this part we're going to focus on all the background, and then we're going to have the twist where it goes in an unexpected place, or maybe we get closer to the goal or the person that is the culprit, and then in the final some type of conclusion, but it also all the characters have moved along with it. So it actually is like, for a good formulaic series, it's been kind of exciting to watch it in that way. And then I watched, I don't know if you've seen it, I've suggested it to you and Caitlin, I think. I Lost My Body, that French movie. Did you watch it?
I haven't watched it.
Gotta watch it.
But I want to. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
on Netflix, right?
Yeah, it's like I have not been moved by anything in a long time. And I was deeply moved by this. I know that sounds like a Broadway review, but I really felt like all the forces were at play. Yeah. What about you? Have you heard anything? Give me some suggestions.
Yeah, I've been consuming more than usual filmically. What's coming to mind? Oh, speaking of pace, Raising Arizona, Coen Brothers.
Haven't seen it.
The first watch, if nothing else, watch the first 10 or 15 minutes. They do a really good job, and Nick Cage is amazing of putting you into a world really rapidly and comically. But it's an interesting study of how quickly you can create an exciting universe. That, speaking of your point about pace, I watched a couple of Cassavetes films that are neat. He's kind of like a father of independent film. And then the one that stands out is called Chronicles of a Summer, and it's about the directors. One was a sociologist, one was an anthropologist, and it was made in the 60s, and they found regular non-actors, and they directed the non-actors to walk around Paris interviewing other non-actors about life, about the two big questions they ask each other are you happy, and how do you do life, or how does your life look, or something. Really kind of broad questions, but it was an early example of sort of cinema verite, sort of just everyday life kind
What's
of.
What's it called?
It's called Chronicle of a Summer.
Wow.
And I like that one a lot. That, to your point about hitting home or touching on the emotions, I like that. I mean, I'm into that kind of thing, obviously, interviewing. But it's back to the idea of it's the everyday experience of humans, and how is that kind of documented in an interesting way, and what do these basic questions tell you about society? If you ask someone what do you do today, and they tell you about their job and their struggles they're having with their boss, and what they really want to pursue if it weren't for needing to pay the bills, and it's really fascinating, and transcends the era that it was made in. I like that one.
So much of what we've talked about has to do with our real everyday life.
Yeah.
I think to your point that you made earlier is that you have that if you actually sat down and made the thing in real time, it might seem like, look at your cute home movie, or look at your little journal that you put together, or whatever. But I also think about what one of my professors said, like, you have no idea what future you is going to be able to make of what present you is doing. And so it's like, even though it might be utterly meaningless, but at the time it could actually be like the worm of something great.
Amen. I think that's everything. It's keep showing up, keep exploring, and if nothing else, you're practicing the premise of showing up and exploring, and that will probably yield an interesting life. You still there?
Ty?
Hey, you back?
So
I thought you were so bored with what I said.
What did you say though? No, what did you my Wi-Fi is like absolutely like, I'm like in the kitchen. My poor roommates like would love to make dinner. I'm just like, I've also been I've moved this mic like too and close to my face, so like a lot of my production skills right now are not coming into play.
Nice.
What did you say?
I was just wrapping up on a high note of what you had said.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect.
Yeah. Well, I was saying, I think the premise of showing up and exploring and trying, even though it might not feel like you're getting anywhere on a day-to-day basis, you are, again, you're practicing those things. And I would wager that the practice of those things will lead to you having an interesting experience in this life. And I commend your efforts, and I'm rooting for you. Oh. And I expect that you'll have a lot of interesting stuff to share with us in the future, as you have already, and that you'll be a guest on the show again, I hope.
Duh. Yeah, I got it. It's been so great to talk with you and actually do this on a microphone. To be able to, have a conversation. I think you have so many moments where you're just going through and you're interacting with life, but then to be able to just articulate it with someone else is super cool.
Yes. Amen.
Yeah. You stay well out there.
You too. I hope to see you in person soon.
I know.
And stay healthy.
Same to you. Yeah. Send my best to the folks.
I will.
Okay.
You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye, Katie. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening. This is Ty McDonald, your host of the Jalapeno Podcast. That was Katie Shepherd, writer, producer, thinker, wonderful Katie Shepherd. Katie, thanks for being on the show. Everyone out there in the world, wishing you the best, as always. See you next time. Connect with you next time on the Jalapeno Podcast. All the best.